She trusted no one, until the mafia boss took a bullet and smiled at her. The rain was an assault, a cold, driving sheet of water that turned the alley into a black river of trash and regret. It plastered thin, dirty hair to her scalp and worked its way through the 3 layers of clothing she wore, chilling her to the bone. She huddled behind the dumpster, its cold, corrugated metal biting into her back. The stench of rotting food and urine was overwhelming, but it was better than the alternative. She'd been running for 6 months. This, however, was a new low. The man from the street corner had been opportunistic, nothing more. He'd seen her digging in the trash can outside the bodega, seen the desperation, and figured she was an easy mark. She was, but she was also a cornered animal. When he'd grabbed her arm, she'd reacted on instinct, raking her nails across his face and kicking his shin. He'd howled, and she had bolted, clutching her backpack to her chest. Now, she listened. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage too small. Every scrape of metal, every distant siren, every gust of wind that rattled the chain-link fence was a threat. She was bruised from the scuffle, a new purple bloom coloring her cheek. But it was the old bruises, the ones on her soul, that kept her shaking. Her backpack was her life. It contained 1 change of socks, a half-empty bottle of water, a stale protein bar, and a small, carved wooden bird her mother had given her. It was everything. She clutched the straps so tightly her knuckles were white. A new sound cut through the downpour. Not footsteps, not the rumble of the nearby highway. It was a low, smooth purr, the sound of expensive engineering. Headlights swept across the wet brick, blinding her, and the sound died as an engine was cut. A car door opened and closed with a heavy, expensive thunk. She pressed herself flatter against the dumpster, trying to melt into the shadows, into the filth. She held her breath, praying, "Don't look, don't see me, go away." Footsteps, slow, deliberate, not the shuffling gait of a drunk or the hurried steps of someone escaping the rain. These were the steps of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He stopped, just yards from her hiding place. She could see the silhouette of him against the alley's mouth, tall, broad-shouldered, and perfectly still. He was wearing a suit. In this neighborhood, in this storm, a suit like that was an anomaly. It was a target, or it was a predator. She fumbled in the muck beside her, her fingers closing around the jagged neck of a broken beer bottle. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all she had. The shadow turned. He'd heard her. "I know you're there," a voice said. It was low, laced with gravel and authority. It wasn't a shout. It barely carried over the rain, but it hit her like a physical blow. She didn't move, didn't breathe. He took a step toward the dumpster. "I'm not going to hurt you." Lies. It was always lies. She'd heard that one before, right before the hand closed around her wrist, right before the backhand. She scrambled out from behind the metal bin, brandishing the bottle. The glass was slick with rain and something she didn't want to identify. Her arm shook, but her voice was a raw hiss. "Get back! I swear to God, I'll do it. I'll cut you." He stopped. He was maybe 10 feet away. The ambient light from the street glinted off the water running down the planes of his face. He was younger than his voice suggested, maybe in his mid-30s, with dark hair and a strong jaw. He looked at the bottle, then at her face. There was no fear in his eyes, no disgust, just that assessment. It was worse. "You're freezing," he said, his voice calm. He shrugged out of his suit jacket, a heavy, dark wool that probably cost more than she'd made in a year. "And you're bleeding." He took another step, holding the coat out. "No, stop." She shrieked, the sound thin in the wet air. "I don't want your money. I don't want anything. Just go away." "I'm not offering money," he said, his patience unnerving. "It's a coat and a ride. Get in the car." "I'd rather die," she spat, and she meant it. She knew men like this. Men who offered rides. Their kindness was just a down payment on a debt you'd pay with your body, or your silence. "You might," he replied, gesturing not at her, but at the alley mouth. "If you stay here." "Hey, bitch, you're still here." The voice was the one she'd run from, the mugger. He was back, And he wasn't alone. 3 of them stood there, silhouetted against the street, their shapes bulky and menacing. And she brought a friend, one of them sneered, eyeing the man in the expensive shirt. Looks like our luck turned, boys. They fanned out, advancing. This was it. The man in the suit hadn't moved. He just stood there, between her and them. He let the coat drop from his hand into the filthy puddle at his feet. "You should leave," he said to the 3 men. His voice hadn't changed. Still calm, still low. The leader laughed. "Or what? You gonna bleed on us, rich boy?" The man in the suit, Leonardo, didn't answer. He simply moved. It wasn't a fight, it was a deletion. He moved with a speed that was terrifying. Before the first man could even raise his hands, Leonardo had closed the distance. There was a sound of a sharp impact, a wet crack, and the man went down, his head hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. The second man lunged, pulling a knife. Leonardo deflected the armed wrist, stepped inside the man's guard, and drove a fist into his throat. The man collapsed, gagging, clutching at his neck. The third, the one who had started it all, froze. He looked at his 2 friends on the ground, then at Leonardo, who was simply watching him, not even breathing hard. "I told you," Leonardo said, "to leave." The man turned and ran. He scrambled over the chain-link fence like a panicked raccoon and disappeared into the night. Silence descended again, broken only by the rain and the pained, wheezing gasps of the man with the crushed throat. Leonardo turned back to her. He hadn't looked at her once during the entire encounter. He was pristine, except for the rain matting his dark hair and the mud splattered on his trousers. He hadn't even broken a sweat. She was still holding the bottle, but her arm had dropped to her side. The fear was different now. It was deeper, colder. This was not a savior. This was a wolf who had just protected his kill from coyotes. He picked up his ruined coat from the puddle and, without wringing it out, draped it over her trembling shoulders. It was heavy with water, but impossibly warm. "Come on," he said. It wasn't a request. He walked her to the car, a hand lightly on her back, steering her. It wasn't a comforting touch. It was a proprietary one. He opened the passenger door of the black sedan. The interior smelled of leather and something clean, like ozone. She hesitated. "He'll be back," Leonardo said, looking at the man who was now trying to crawl away. "And he'll bring more friends, or the police. You don't want either. Get in the car." She got in. The ride was silent. The city blurred past, a watercolor of neon and misery. She sat pressed against the door, the wet coat a heavy shroud. Her backpack was in her lap, her knuckles still white on the straps. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He drove with one hand, his profile cut from stone. He wasn't looking at her. He was just driving. He didn't take her to a police station. He didn't take her to a hospital. He drove to a part of the city she'd only ever seen in magazines, where the buildings were glass and steel and touched the clouds. He pulled into a private underground garage, the gate closing behind them with a heavy, final thud. They rode an elevator that required a key card and a fingerprint. It opened directly into a room that was less an apartment and more a slice of the sky. The walls were glass on 2 sides, looking down on the storm-lashed city from what must have been 30 or 40 stories up. The furniture was sparse, modern, and impossibly clean. She stood dripping on a white marble floor, a stain in his perfect world. He didn't seem to notice. He walked to a sleek, dark kitchen. "There's a shower through that door," he said, pointing to a hallway. "There are clothes in the closet. Towels are in the bathroom. I'll leave food on the counter." She just stared at him, vibrating with suspicion. "What do you want?" He paused, his back to her. He turned, and for the first time, he really looked at her. His eyes were dark, and they held an unsettling depth. "I want," he said slowly, "for you to stop shaking. Go, get warm." He made no demands. He didn't ask her name. He didn't touch her. He simply turned back to the kitchen and started opening cabinets. She didn't move for a full minute. Then, her survival instincts screaming at her, she backed away, down the hall he had indicated. She found a bathroom larger than any apartment she'd ever lived in, all black slate and glass. She locked the door, a heavy, sliding bolt, and leaned against it, her legs finally giving out. She didn't shower. She was afraid to make a sound, afraid to be weak, afraid to be naked, but she was so cold. Eventually, she turned on the water, as hot as she could stand, and just sat on the floor of the stall, letting it wash away the alley's grime. She cried then, silent, racking sobs that hurt her bruised ribs. When she finally emerged, wrapped in a towel that felt like a cloud, she found clothes laid out on the bed in the adjoining room. Not lingerie, not a man's shirt. Simple black sweatpants and a thick, soft gray hoodie. They were new. She dressed, the fabric warm against her clean skin. She crept back into the main room. A tray was on the kitchen island, a bowl of thick soup, a loaf of crusty bread, and a glass of water. He was nowhere to be seen. She searched the apartment like a trapped mouse. She checked the windows. They didn't open. She checked the front door, the elevator, but the control panel was dead without his key. She was a prisoner, a well-appointed prisoner. She found him on the couch. He had taken off his wet shirt and shoes and was asleep, or pretending to be, covered only by a thin throw blanket. He'd given her the bed, the shower, the food. He had taken the couch. It was the most confusing, terrifying thing that had happened to her all night. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. She spent the entire night pacing the vast, silent living room, from the windows to the elevator and back. She'd jump at every rumble of thunder, every shift of the building in the wind. She watched him on the couch, looking for any sign of a threat. The silence was a void, and her past rushed in to fill it. She saw Dante's face, his smile, slick and false, that never reached his eyes, the smell of the chemicals he used to cut his product, a sharp, bitter tang that clung to the apartment, to her clothes, to her. She remembered the night it all ended, the argument. Not with her, this time. With his new partner. The money was wrong, the voices got loud. She'd been hiding in the kitchen, making herself small, just as she'd done behind the dumpster. Then the sound, not a gunshot, a heavy, wet thump. And then? Silence. A terrible, heavy silence. She'd crept out. The partner was on the floor. Dante was standing over him, holding a tire iron. He looked at her, his eyes flat, dead, and he smiled. "You saw nothing," he whispered, dropping the metal bar. "You were never here. You saw nothing." His hand had closed on her arm, his fingers bruising her. Right? She had nodded, mute with terror. And the next day, when he'd gone out for cigarettes, she had grabbed her backpack and ran. She'd been running ever since, running from Dante, running from what she saw, running from the knowledge that he would kill her to ensure her silence. The man on the couch shifted. Leonardo. She froze. His eyes were closed, his breathing even, but he wasn't asleep. He had been watching her through slitted lids. He knew she was broken. He knew she was terrified. He had watched her pace for hours, watched her flinch at the lightning, watched her stare at the locked door. Finally, near dawn, her exhausted body had betrayed her. She had slumped to the floor, her back against the cold glass window, and fallen into a fitful, haunted doze. Leonardo sat up, the blanket pooling in his lap. He looked at the woman curled up by the window, her face pale and streaked with old tears, her hand still clutching her backpack. He saw the bruise on her cheek, the raw fear that clung to her even in sleep. He rose quietly, walking to the window. He stood over her, a dark shadow against the emerging gray light. "I don't know who hurt you," he whispered to the sleeping woman, his voice a vow aimed at the storm-tossed sky. "But they'll never touch you again." She woke with a gasp. The sun was up. The apartment was bright. The storm passed, leaving a scoured, clean sky. He was gone. Panic seized her. She scrambled to her feet, her heart leaping into her throat. Was she locked in? Had he left her here to starve? She ran to the elevator. It was still inactive. Then she saw it, on the kitchen island, where the soup had been. A small, thick piece of cardstock. Next to it was a fresh bottle of water and an apple. A note, written in strong, black ink. "Stay or go. No one will stop you." She looked at the note. She looked at the elevator doors. She walked over and touched the control panel. This time, the button for the lobby was illuminated, glowing a soft, steady green. She stared at the door, her hand trembling. Go. She could go. Back to the alleys, back to the shelters, back to the rain, back to running from Dante, or she could stay in the fortress. With the wolf, she stood there, torn, her hand hovering over the button, the silence of the penthouse roaring in her ears. She stayed. The green light of the elevator button was a taunt, a promise of freedom that felt like a trap. She stood in front of it for what felt like an hour, her body a war zone of conflicting instincts. To run was to live. That had been her only rule for 6 months, but her feet, God, her feet. She had limped to the bathroom to inspect them, and the sight had made her sick. The thin, soaked sneakers she'd worn for weeks had rubbed the skin raw, the pavement, the filth, the endless walking. Her soles were a landscape of blood and blisters. She was just so tired. The thought of the cold concrete, the scramble for scraps, the constant shrieking paranoia of being seen. She couldn't, not today. She sank onto the plush white sofa, a place she didn't belong, and clutched her backpack. Staying wasn't trust. It was just a different kind of surrender. It was the exhaustion of a prey animal that had run until its lungs burned and its legs buckled, finally collapsing while the predator simply watched. She must have slept, because she woke with a start to the sound of the elevator. Leonardo stood there, immaculate in a fresh black shirt and trousers. He looked as if the alley and the rain had never touched him. He carried a small, simple shopping bag. "You're awake," he said. It wasn't a question. He didn't seem surprised to find her there. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering. You're hungry," he interrupted, not unkindly. He set the bag on the counter. It contained new socks, antiseptic cream, and a box of high-grade bandages. He nodded to her feet, which she'd tried to hide under a cushion. "Fix those, then we'll eat." He disappeared into his bedroom. She stared at the bag, antiseptic, bandages. He knew. He had seen. The clinical, impersonal nature of the items was almost more intimate than a kind word would have been. She snatched the bag and fled to the bathroom, locking the door again. The process was agonizing. Cleaning the wounds made her wince and bite her lip to keep from crying out. But the thick, clean cotton socks that followed were a luxury she hadn't felt in a year. When she emerged, padding silently on the plush carpet, he was waiting by the elevator, holding a different coat. This one was a simple, dark gray pea coat. It looked warm. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice rough. "To eat," he said. "The food you left was fine. That was a snack. This is breakfast." He held the coat open for her. She flinched, taking a step back. "I can put it on myself." His expression didn't change. He simply held it, patient. "I'm sure you can." Defeated and chilled by the memory of the night, she turned and slid her arms into the sleeves. It was ridiculously large, swallowing her, but it was lined with cashmere and smelled faintly of him, clean, expensive soap, and something metallic, like steel. His hands brushed her shoulders as he settled it, and she fought the urge to bolt. The touch was feather-light, impersonal, yet it burned. The restaurant wasn't just quiet, it was empty. They had walked in through the kitchen, a gleaming expanse of stainless steel where a chef and 2 line cooks had nodded at Leonardo with a deference that was almost fear. "Just coffee for me, Marco," Leonardo had said. "She'll have everything." Now she sat at a small table in a vast, sunlit room with dark wood floors and white tablecloths. The morning light streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Leonardo sat at a table across the room, near the door, drinking his coffee and reading a newspaper. He hadn't sat with her. He had given her the entire restaurant as a buffer zone, a waiter, his face a polite, neutral mask, brought her food, not just food, a feast, eggs, pancakes, bacon, fresh fruit, toast, orange juice. It was more food than she had seen in one place in months. She stared at it, her stomach clenching. "Eat." Leonardo's voice carried across the room. He hadn't even looked up from his paper. She ate. She ate like a starved wolf. her hands shaking at first, then moving with desperate speed. She didn't care about manners. She just needed the fuel. She ate until she was painfully full, until the adrenaline that had kept her going for days finally receded, leaving a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion in its place. When she was done, she sat back, her hands in the lap of the hoodie he'd given her. She was wearing his clothes, eating his food, in his restaurant. She was a stray, a pet. He folded his newspaper and stood, walking over to her table. She tensed, her body preparing to flee. He stopped a few feet away. "Better?" She nodded, unable to speak. He looked down at her feet, visible in the new socks beneath the table. One of her sneakers, which she'd tried to clean in the sink, was on the floor beside her chair, its lace undone. Before she could react, he knelt. Not a bow, but a practical, one-kneed crouch. He picked up the sneaker. "No," she gasped, pulling her feet back. "Don't, I can do it." He ignored her, his large, clean hands taking the dirty, frayed lace. "It's just a shoelace." He began to thread it, his movements economical and precise. She stared at the top of his dark head, at the breadth of his shoulders, a man who could kill with his bare hands, kneeling at her feet to tie a shoe. The cognitive dissonance was so profound it made her dizzy. She saw the other men in the kitchen watching from the steel-rimmed window, their faces carefully blank. She flinched again as his knuckles brushed her ankle. He paused, his hands still on the shoe. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. His gaze was intense, unreadable, and it held her captive. "You don't owe me anything," he said, his voice low and absolute. "Not for the coat, not for the food, not for this. Do you understand?" She stared, her throat dry. He was drawing a line. He was telling her this wasn't that kind of transaction, but in her world, everything was a transaction. Kindness was just a currency for a later, more painful payment. He finished tying the lace, a perfect, tight bow. He placed the sneaker gently on the floor beside its partner, then he stood, towering over her. "Let's go," he said, and walked away, leaving her to follow. Later that day, she heard it. He was in his study, a room she hadn't dared to enter, speaking in low, urgent tones on the phone. She was creeping to the kitchen for water, her socked feet silent on the marble. The elevator chimed, and two men stepped out. They were built like refrigerators, in suits that were only slightly less expensive than Leonardo's. They didn't see her. They stopped, waiting for their boss to emerge. "What's with the girl?" one of them muttered. "Dunno," the other grunted. "Boss found her in an alley, like a stray, gave her the penthouse." "The boss is going soft," the first one said with a nervous laugh. "Bringing home strays?" "You tell him that," the second man challenged. The study door opened. Leonardo stepped out. The men snapped to attention, their casual demeanor vanishing, replaced by a rigid military focus. "Anything?" Leonardo asked. "Nothing yet. Boss, the neighborhood is clean. No one's talking about the incident. The two guys you tagged are in the ER with unspecified trauma. They won't be talking to anyone. And the third? Vanished. We're looking..." Leonardo nodded. "Find him." He glanced over and saw her. She was frozen by the kitchen island, a glass of water halfway to her lips. His eyes hardened, not at her, but at his men. "Get out! Boss, get out! Use the stairs!" The two men who could have broken her in half with one hand looked genuinely terrified. They scrambled to the stairwell door and disappeared. Leonardo watched them go, his jaw tight. He turned to her. She expected him to be angry, to yell at her for eavesdropping. He just looked tired. "Stray girl," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. Soft. His expression didn't change. "My men are idiots, and you are not a stray." He walked past her and poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid glinting in the afternoon light. "You're a complication, but you're not a stray." She didn't know what to do with that. That night, she explored. He was gone, taken by the two men in the elevator. The penthouse was hers, and the silence was vast. She was still a prisoner, but a curious one. She opened his drawers. She found books, not just thrillers or business manuals. Thick, leather-bound classics, history, philosophy, poetry, A worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo had notes in the margins, written in a sharp, intelligent hand. She found weapons. Not just the one she assumed he carried. There was a safe in his closet, and she had watched him open it. Inside, glinting on black velvet, were at least 3 handguns, several magazines of ammunition, and 2 long, wicked-looking knives. And she found the scars. He had returned late, and she had pretended to be asleep on the couch, the bed in the guest room still feeling too much like a trap. He had walked into the living room, unbuttoning his shirt. He must have thought she was asleep. He stripped off the shirt, his back to her. Her breath caught. His back was a road map of violence. A long, puckered scar ran from his left shoulder blade down to his ribs, clearly from a knife. Several smaller, rounder scars dotted his side, old bullet wounds. This was not a rich thug. This was a soldier. A man who had been in a war and, by the looks of it, was still fighting one. He turned, and she saw a fresh, angry purple bruise high on his ribs, likely from the fight in the alley. He winced as he moved, and she realized he'd been hurt last night and hadn't shown it. Not for a second, he saw her watching him. She was sitting up, her eyes wide. He didn't cover himself. He didn't apologize or explain. He just held her gaze for a long, heavy moment before pulling on a clean t-shirt and walking into his room, closing the door behind him. The weight of it all, the alley, the fear, the food, the kindness, the violence, the scars, it all became too much. The hot water and the clean clothes and the soft bed were a lie. They were a thin, civilized veneer over a world that was just as brutal as the one she'd left. She went to the bathroom, turned on the shower, and broke. The hot water hit her wounds, old and new. It hit the raw skin of her feet, the fading bruise on her cheek, the deep, aching soreness in her ribs from where the mugger had shoved her, and the dam she had built inside her, the one that held back 6 months of terror and grief and starvation. It just shattered. She sank to the shower floor, just as she had the night before, but this time, she sobbed. She wept for her old life, for her mother, for the girl she had been before Dante, before the murder, before the alley. She cried for the sheer, animal terror of being hunted and for the new, confusing terror of being kept. The sobs were violent, ripping from her throat, raw and painful and loud. She didn't care. She couldn't stop. She didn't know how long she was in there. When the water finally started to run cold, she forced herself to stand. Her body was limp, her eyes swollen. She turned off the water, the sudden silence deafening. She heard it then, a faint sound from the other side of the door, breathing. He was out there. He'd been out there the whole time. He had heard everything, humiliation, hot and sharp, flooded her. She wanted to disappear, to die. She slowly wrapped a towel around her body, her hands shaking. She couldn't stay in here forever. She opened the door. He was there, just as she'd known. He wasn't leaning against the wall, not trying to be casual. He was standing, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. He looked at her red-rimmed eyes, her wet hair clinging to her face. She braced for the question, "What's wrong with you?" or the dismissal, "Get over it." "I'm here," he said, his voice quiet, rough. "If you want to talk." She shook her head, clutching the towel tighter. Come on," he said, and for the first time, his voice was gentle. He walked not to the bedroom, but to the living room, to the wall of glass that overlooked the glittering city. He sat on the floor, his back against a low sofa, and looked out at the lights. He'd left a space for her. She hesitated, then slowly, cautiously. She sank to the floor a few feet away from him, wrapping her arms around her knees. The towel was still damp. Her hoodie was in the bathroom. He saw her shiver. "Wait," he said. He got up, went to his room, and came back with the cashmere-lined peacoat. He didn't try to put it on her. He just dropped it over her shoulders. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the city breathe below them. The cars were just tiny streams of red and white light. It was peaceful, and it made the chaos inside her feel even more pronounced. "They'll find me," she whispered, her voice a cracked ruin. He didn't turn. "Who?" The man I ran from, he won't stop. What did he do? She shook her head, the old terror closing her throat. I can't. This man, Leonardo said, his voice still fixed on the horizon. Is he the one who hurt you? The one who made you run? She nodded. A single sharp movement. Tell me, he said. It wasn't a demand, it was an opening, and the words, just a few of them, tumbled out. I saw something I wasn't supposed to, a bad thing, and I ran. I just ran. It was a sliver, a tiny, pathetic sliver of the truth, but it was more than she had told anyone. He turned his head then, looking at her. The moonlight from the window carved his face into sharp angles of light and shadow. He seemed to absorb her words, to weigh them. He slowly, so slowly, raised one hand. She tensed, her eyes flying to his. His hand was large, his fingers long. It was the hand that had tied her shoe. It was the hand that had shattered a man's throat. He moved with painstaking deliberation, letting her see his intent, giving her every opportunity to pull away. He reached for her face, and she flinched, but didn't retreat. His fingers were warm. He gently brushed the still damp hair from her cheek, his thumb coming to rest just below her eye, near the bruise. His touch was so light it was barely there, yet it sent a jolt through her entire body. It wasn't sexual. It was proprietary. It was a claim. He leaned in, just a fraction. His eyes searched hers, dark and deep. She could feel his breath on her skin. She could smell the faint scent of the whiskey he'd had earlier, mixed with that clean, metallic smell of his. Her own breath hitched, her lips parted. She saw his eyes drop to her mouth. This was it, the payment. He was so close. The air between them was electric, thick with unspoken things. Her heart was a trapped bird, beating against the cage of her ribs. Part of her, a deep, starved, lonely part, wanted to close the distance. She wanted to be held. She wanted to be claimed. She wanted to, for 1 second, not be terrified. But the fear won. It always won. She pulled back, scrambling away a few inches, her back hitting the sofa. Don't, she breathed, the word torn from her. Leonardo didn't pursue her. He didn't look angry. He simply let his hand fall, a slow, controlled retraction. He held her gaze, and a flicker of something she couldn't name, regret, respect, passed through his eyes. He let the silence stretch. Then he leaned back, turning his gaze back to the city lights. You'll come to me when you're ready, he whispered, not to her, but to the glass. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact, and the chemistry, terrifying and undeniable, hung in the air between them, as heavy and suffocating as the storm had been. Trust is not a fortress, built overnight. It is a fragile thing, a seed that grows in silence, in the spaces between words. For her, it began with the small things. It began with the silence. Leonardo was not a man who filled the air with noise. He didn't ask her questions, didn't pry into her past, didn't demand to know her name. He simply existed, a solid, quiet presence in the vast, glass-walled penthouse. His silence was a shield, not a weapon. It gave her room to breathe, to slowly, cautiously, let her own lungs expand after 6 months of being compressed by fear. It grew with the security, the heavy, final thud of the elevator door, the fact that no one could get up here without his fingerprint, the way his men treated the space with a reverence that bordered on fear. This place was a vault, after so long on the streets, where every shadow was a threat and every sound a potential danger. The sheer, unbreachable safety of the penthouse was a drug. She began to sleep, not just the fitful, one-eye-open dozing of the first few days, but real, deep sleep that lasted 3, then 4, then 6 hours at a stretch, and it was sealed by his restraint. He had made that one quiet statement. You'll come to me when you're ready. He had held to it. He never touched her. Not an accidental brush of hands as they both reached for the coffee, not a hand on her back to guide her. He gave her space as if it were a physical currency. He'd leave food for her, then go to his study. He'd sit on the far end of the long sofa to read his reports, leaving the entire rest of the room to her. He didn't invade. He didn't crowd. He just was.
And in doing so, he became the first man in her life who didn't take... She began to relax, muscle by muscle. She stopped flinching when he entered a room. She started wearing the new, soft clothes he'd had delivered, instead of the sweats she'd been living in. She even, one afternoon, found herself sitting at the kitchen island, sketching on a napkin, while he took a phone call in his study, the door slightly ajar. She couldn't hear the words, only the tone. His voice was different from the one he used with her. It was cold, sharp, and absolute, inside the study. Leonardo stood looking at the city, his back to the room. The phone was pressed hard to his ear. Dante, the voice on the other end, said, "That's the name. Dante Russo, small-time cokehead with delusions of grandeur. Used to run with the Miller crew before they got busted. And now?" Leonardo's voice was ice. "Now, he's desperate. He's been asking around, quiet-like, about a girl, his girl. He says, the one who saw him brain his partner." Leonardo's knuckles whitened on the phone. He glanced through the crack in the door, just enough to see the top of her head as she sketched. "The problem, boss," the voice continued, "is who he's asking. He's been seen talking to Albini's people." Leonardo's blood ran cold. The Albinis, his only real rivals in the city, a family as old as his, but without his code. They were rats who dealt in human trafficking and poison, and they'd been looking for a weakness, any leverage, for years. So Russo is trying to sell her location, in exchange for, what? Protection? Or a payday? He's telling them she's a witness, that she's leverage. He's trying to get in with them, and he's using her as his buy-in. He's looking for her, Leo, hard. And he's working with our enemies to do it. Leonardo was silent. He watched her tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. He had kept her here, in the most secure place he owned. He had protected her from the street, but in doing so, he had trapped her in the sky, a gilded cage while the hunters gathered below. He kept the knowledge locked behind his teeth. For now, it was his burden, not hers. "Find him," Leonardo said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I want to know every move he makes, every person he talks to. Find him, but do not engage. He's mine." He hung up and stood for a long moment, the weight of the threat settling on his shoulders. He would not let them touch her. A few days later, she found him. He was in the living room, reading a thick, leather-bound book. She stood for a full minute, her hands twisting in the hem of her shirt. "Leonardo?" He looked up. His eyes were patient. He put the book down. I need to ask you for something," she said, her voice small. "Ask. I need a phone. Just for one call." His expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. He was calculating. A phone was a link to the outside, a way to call for help, a way to betray him, a way to get found. "Who do you need to call?" "A friend," she said, the words rushing out. "Her name is Maria. She was in a bad situation, too, with him, with Dante. When I ran, I tried to get her to come, but she was too scared. I need to know if she's okay. I need to call the shelter, the one on the west side, see if she ever made it." He studied her, seeing the genuine, desperate fear in her eyes. It wasn't for herself. He nodded once. He went to his study and returned with a sleek, black burner phone. It was heavy, anonymous. "This is a secured line phone. It's untraceable. I'll program the number for you. You have 1 hour." He handed it to her. Her fingers trembled as she took it. She gave him the number, and he programmed it, his thumbs moving with practiced speed. He handed it back. "The call will route through 3 different countries. No one will know where you are." He then walked to the far side of the penthouse, to the terrace, and stepped outside, sliding the glass door shut. He was giving her privacy. She clutched the phone, her heart hammering. She dialed. The phone rang once, twice. "St. Jude's Shelter." The voice was tired, female. "Hi, I'm calling to see if... Do you have a resident there named Maria Sanchez? We can't give out information on our residents, ma'am. It's a privacy policy." "No, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I'm not trying to find her. I'm a friend. I'm just so scared. I need to know she's safe. She was supposed to meet me.
But she never is she there? Is she alive? There was a long pause. The woman on the other end sighed. Honey, we get a lot of Mariahs, but Sanchez? No. No one by that name has checked in. Not in the last 6 months. I'm sorry. The line clicked. She stared at the phone. No one by that name. Maria was gone. She was still out there. Or she was. The phone felt like a block of ice in her hand, the small, fragile hope she had been nursing, the one that maybe her friend had also escaped, died. She was truly alone. Leonardo slid the door open. He had known. He had seen the call end, had seen her shoulders slump. He walked over, his face grim. She's not there, she whispered. I'm sorry, he said, and she knew he meant it. I need to get out, she said, the words surprising her. I can't. The glass. I feel like I'm going to suffocate. Just for an hour. Please. He looked at her, at the fresh wave of despair. He made a decision. All right, not outside, not on the street, but I have a place. The place was a garden, a private, walled garden on the roof of a building he owned downtown. It was an oasis of green in a city of concrete. No one could see in. The walls were 10 feet high, covered in ivy. It was the first time she had felt grass under her feet in half a year. She had taken off her shoes and was just walking in the small, manicured lawn, breathing in the scent of damp earth and roses. Leonardo stood by the entrance, watching her, a silent guardian. It was on the drive back. He was navigating the late afternoon traffic, the car a silent, armored cocoon. She was looking out the window, watching the people, the life on the street, feeling a strange disconnect. Then she saw it, a dark blue, late 90s sedan, a busted left taillight, repaired with red tape, a dent on the passenger side door, a bumper sticker for a band he loved, Dante's car. It was idling at the light 2 lanes over. She couldn't see the driver. It didn't matter. The air left her lungs. Her vision tunneled. The sounds of the city, the hum of the engine. It all disappeared. She was back. She was in the kitchen. The smell of chemicals in her nose, the sound of the tire iron meeting flesh. Thump, thump. No, she whimpered. She wasn't in the penthouse. She wasn't safe. He was here. He was right there. No, 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 no. She started to rock, her hands flying to her head, pulling at her hair. He's here. He's here. Let me out. He's going to see me. Let me out. What? Leonardo's head snapped toward her. The light turned green. The blue car turned the corner, disappearing. Who? Who is here? He demanded. The car. It was his car. He's here. He's going to kill me. Let me out. She lunged for the door handle. Her mind shattered. All reason gone. She was a cornered animal again, and she would chew off her own leg to escape. Leonardo swore. A sharp, violent curse. He wrenched the wheel, turning the sedan into a private underground parking garage, swerving past the security arm and into a dark, empty corner. He slammed the car into park and killed the engine. She was still screaming, a high, thin sound of pure terror, still fumbling with the door handle. He was out of the car in an instant, yanking her door open and pulling her out. She fell against him, her legs gone. He's here! He's here! He's not here! Leonardo's voice was a cannon, cutting through her panic. He dragged her, half carrying her, to the only other door in the corner, the fire exit. He slammed it open, pulled her inside, and let it slam shut, plunging them into the dim, concrete-scented silence of the stairwell. She collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the dusty floor, her body convulsing with hyperventilation. I can't. I can't. Breathe, he commanded, crouching in front of her. Look at me. He grabbed her face, his hands hard, forcing her to look at him. You are not there. You are here. You are with me. He is not here. Breathe. She stared into his dark eyes, her own wide and unseeing. She was still in the alley. She was still in the kitchen. He held her face, his thumbs on her cheekbones. Breathe with me. In. He took a deep, exaggerated breath. Out. She tried, but her breath came in ragged, terrified gasps. Her hands flew up, not to push him away, but to grab him.
She clutched the lapels of his jacket, her knuckles white. She was drowning, and he was the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into pure terror. "Please," she sobbed, the word tearing out of her. "Don't let him. Please." "I won't," he said, his voice a low, rough vow. "I will never let him touch you." He held her. He didn't pat her back. He didn't shush her. He simply held her, a solid, immovable object in her storm. He pulled her closer, his arms going around her, enclosing her, until her face was pressed against his chest. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart under her cheek. She could smell the soap and steel of him, and her panic, that screaming, deafening storm, finally found its center. It began to recede. Not vanishing, but coalescing. The adrenaline was still there, a wildfire in her veins, but the terror was shifting. It was melting into something else, a new, sharp, desperate need. She was alive. He had saved her. He was holding her. She was safe. Her trembling hands, still clutching his jacket, moved. They slid up, over his shoulders, to his neck. Her fingers were so cold, she was still shaking. She pulled herself up, her eyes, still wet, fixed on his. She wasn't thinking. She was just feeling. She was alive, and he was the reason. She kissed him. It was a collision. Her mouth, desperate and clumsy, finding his. It was the frantic animal instinct to connect, to affirm life in the face of death. Her fingers dug into his hair, her body still shaking, pressed against his. He froze. Just for a second, a sharp, controlled intake of breath. Then he responded. His response was not desperate. It was absolute. His hands, which had been holding her, moved. One hand went to the back of her head, tangling in her hair, holding her steady. The other slid down her back, settling on the small of it, pulling her impossibly closer, until their bodies were flush. He took control of the kiss, his mouth firm, intense, and possessive. It was not the gentle restraint of the penthouse. This was fire. This was the man who had decimated 3 attackers in an alley. This was a claim. He was anchoring her, telling her without words that she was his to protect, his to hold. She whimpered, the last of the panic giving way to a new, overwhelming sensation. Need, raw, undeniable need. She wasn't just safe. She was wanted. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both breathing hard. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his voice was a raw growl. Not here. He led her back to the car. The ride to the penthouse was silent, but the air was so thick with tension it was a living thing. He didn't let go of her hand, not in the elevator, not as they walked into the apartment, the moment the elevator door shut, sealing them in. She turned to him. She was the one who moved first. She reached up and put her hands on his chest. She was still trembling, but for a different reason. "I'm not," she whispered, "afraid of you." His eyes darkened. He slowly, so slowly, lifted his hands and cupped her face. His touch was reverent now, his rough thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "You should be," he whispered, but his voice was thick with emotion. "But I'm not," she said again, and she rose on her toes, initiating the kiss this time. This one was different. It was slow. It was emotional. It was her, finally releasing control. It was her, finally choosing to trust. His hands were careful, his touch almost hesitant, as if he was afraid of breaking her. He kissed her face, her jaw, her throat, as her own tears, hot and silent, began to fall. They weren't tears of fear. They were tears of release. He guided her to the bedroom, his room, and for the first time, she walked in without fear. He was a man of scars, a man of violence, but his hands, as they brushed the hair from her face, as they undid the buttons on her coat, were the gentlest things she'd ever known. She was giving him the one thing she had left, her trust, and he was receiving it like the fragile, priceless thing it was. She woke to the sun streaming in. The bed was vast, the sheets impossibly soft, and she was alone. The silence of the room hit her, and with it, the cold, sharp, brutal light of day. What have you done? The old voice, the one that had kept her alive, the one that sounded like Dante. "You're a fool. You're just a stray. You let him. You're nothing. He'd gotten what he wanted. The food, the clothes, the safety. It was all just a long con. And she had fallen for it, like the stupid, desperate girl she was. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She scrambled from the bed, her body aching, her heart pounding with a new, sick terror. She found the hoodie and sweatpants he'd first given her. Pulling them on, she grabbed her backpack, still packed, still by the door of the guest room. She had to run. He had used her. He had seen her at her weakest, her most broken, and he had used her. She ran through the silent penthouse, her bare feet silent on the marble. She reached the elevator, jabbing the button with a frantic, trembling finger. She just had to get to the street. She'd take her chances with Dante. It was better than this, better than being a fool in a gilded cage. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. He was standing there. He was in a fresh black suit, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand. He hadn't been leaving. He had been coming back. He saw her. He saw the backpack. He saw the wild terror in her eyes, the way she was poised for flight. A deep, profound weariness settled over his features. He stepped into the elevator, his body blocking her only exit. He hit the button, and the doors slid shut. "Where?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Do you think you're going?" "Let me out," she hissed, her back against the wall. "You got what you wanted. Just let me go." His face hardened. He set the coffee cup down on the floor and stepped toward her, invading her space, until she was pinned. "What I wanted," he said, his voice a low growl. "You think that's what that was?" "It always is," she cried. "Last night," he said, his voice dropping, intense, "was not for me. It was for you. It was you. Remembering you were alive. It was you. Finally, not being afraid. Do you have any idea?" He stopped, visibly reining in a flash of anger. "If you think I'd go through all of this, just for that, then you're still not seeing me. And if you think I'll let you run back to the street after what I just found out, you're wrong." "What you found out?" she whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a cold dread. "The car?" The car was just the beginning. He looked her in the eye, his gaze pinning her. "You're right. Your ex, Dante. He knows you're alive. He's not just looking for you. He's working with the Albinus, my rivals." She stared at him, not understanding. "He's trying to trade you. Don't you get it? He's selling your location. There's a price on your head. They're not just hunting you. They're hunting you." It all clicked. The phone call, his secrecy, the controlled garden trip. It wasn't a cage to keep her. It was a fortress to protect her. The tears she'd expected to feel. The panic. It didn't come. The fear was there. But it was cold now, hard and sharp. It wasn't the blind terror of the stairwell. It was the clarifying reality of her new life. She had run from one monster, only to find he had allied with bigger ones, and she had run directly into the fortress of their greatest enemy. She looked at Leonardo, really looked at him. The suit, the power, the man who had taken her in. She didn't cry. Her voice was flat, empty of emotion. "Will you kill him?" Leonardo watched her, saw the terror recede, saw the ice form. He saw the last of the stray disappear, replaced by something new, something hard, something that might just survive. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "I'll let you decide." The penthouse had been a vault. His estate was a fortress. It was nestled 20 miles outside the city, a sprawling compound of old stone and new glass hidden deep within 100 acres of private forest. The gates were 20-foot-high wrought iron, manned by guards who carried more than just pistols. There were cameras hidden in the ancient oak trees, and a sense of absolute, impenetrable security that made the penthouse feel like a glass box. But where the penthouse had been a sterile, silent prison in the sky, the estate was alive. It was a home. There was a staff that wasn't just his men, a housekeeper named Sophia who clucked at her like a worried mother hen, a chef who insisted she was too thin and plied her with fresh pasta. And there was his inner circle. The men she had first seen as menacing refrigerators were a constant presence. At first, they had been wary, their eyes following her, unsure of her place. But after the move, after Leonardo had made it clear she was not a guest but a permanent fixture, their attitude shifted. The man who had guarded the elevator, a broad-shouldered giant named Marcus, now nodded to her and said "ma'am" every morning. He even, one afternoon, found her struggling with a jammed window and gently muscled it open for her, his expression carefully neutral. They no longer saw her as the stray girl. They saw her as the boss's woman, and in their world, that meant she was to be protected with the same silent, brutal finality as Leonardo himself. They were beginning to accept her. The most terrifying part was, she was beginning to accept them. "You're afraid of it," Leonardo said. His voice was calm, cutting through the crisp autumn air. They were on the far side of the estate, at a private outdoor shooting range backed by a high earthen berm. He had placed a small, black handgun on the wooden table. It looked alien, a piece of sculpted death, and she hated it. "I don't want to touch it," she said, her hands jammed in the pockets of his old jacket. "I know. That's why you have to—" He stepped up behind her, not touching, but his presence was a wall of heat. "You're reluctant. That's good. It means you understand what it is, but you're also determined." "Determined to what?" "To never be helpless again," he finished, his voice quiet. He was right. The memory of the alley, the broken bottle, the sheer, pathetic uselessness of it. It was a cold knot in her stomach. She looked at the gun. Then she looked at him. He was patient, his dark eyes watching her, waiting for her to make the choice. She pulled her hands from her pockets and slowly, her fingers trembling, she reached out and touched the cold steel grip. "Show me." He spent an hour with her. His instruction was like everything else he did, precise, economical, and devoid of wasted motion. He showed her how to stand, how to breathe, how to hold the weapon with both hands, a firm grip that anchored it. He placed noise-canceling earmuffs over her head, his fingers brushing her hair, and she fought the flinch. "Don't aim," he said, his voice now slightly muffled. "Just point. Feel where it's going. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." She stared at the paper target 30 feet away. It was just a black silhouette, but she saw Dante's face. She saw the man who had grabbed her in the alley. She squeezed her eyes shut, took a shaky breath, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow. It slammed her shoulder and she yelped. Stumbling back, the gun felt like it had tried to leap from her hands. She had missed the target entirely. She hadn't even hit the paper. She looked at the weapon, now smoking faintly with renewed terror. "Good," Leonardo said. "Good," she choked. "I missed everything." "You fired," he said, his voice flat. "You pulled the trigger. The rest is just practice." He gently took the gun from her trembling hands and placed it back on the table. "That's enough for today." He started to walk back to the house. She stood there, her hands shaking, the smell of gunpowder in her nose. She looked at the target, then at his retreating back. "No," she said. He stopped, turning. She walked back to the table, her jaw set. She picked up the gun, her movements clumsy, but she forced herself to mimic the stance he had shown her. "Show me again." A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. He walked back, his gaze fixed on her, and this time, when he stood behind her, he put his hands over hers, guiding her. His body was a shield, his arms caging her in, his broad chest pressed against her back. "Like this," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "Breathe out and squeeze." She did. The shot was still loud, but this time, braced by him, it didn't throw her. A small black hole appeared in the outer ring of the paper. She stared at it, her heart hammering. It was a start. Their intimacy was no longer built on trauma and rescue. It was built on the quiet moments in between. It was built on the late nights, when the estate was silent and they would sit in the grand library, a room he had built for himself. He would read his reports, and she would read from one of the thousands of books he owned. One night, she found him staring at the empty fireplace, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. She sat on the floor, her back against his chair. "You never talk about them," she said quietly. "Your family." He was so still. She thought he wouldn't answer. I don't have one, he said, and his voice flat. Not in the way you mean. The scars, she said, her voice even quieter. The ones on your back. They're old. Older than your men. Older than this house. He took a long, slow drink of the whiskey. I was 12 years old, he said, his voice rough, staring at the empty hearth. My parents, they were good people. Wrong place, wrong time. Owed the wrong man. I was orphaned. The system. You know what that is. Foster care, group homes. He said the words like they were poison. I ran. I lived on the streets. I was just like you, in that alley. Just a stray. She turned, looking up at his profile, the hard jaw, the unyielding line of his mouth. A man found me, he continued, an old-school family man, Sal. He saw me trying to lift his wallet. Instead of breaking my hand, he bought me dinner. He took me in. He and his crew, they were criminals. They were thieves. And they were the only ones who protected their own. The system, the cops, they protect the rich. Sal protected the forgotten, the kids like me. He turned his head, his dark eyes finally meeting hers. He taught me how to fight. He taught me how to read. He taught me how to earn respect. And when he died, I took what he taught me, and I built this. I built it so no one I care about will ever be at the mercy of the system again. I built it to protect those the world forgot. She stared at him, her heart aching. He wasn't just a mafia boss. He was a product of the same broken world that had spit her out. He was the king of the broken toys, the protector of strays. So when I saw you, he whispered, his voice so low she could barely hear it, hiding behind that dumpster, with a broken bottle and fire in your eyes. I wasn't just seeing you. I was seeing me. She slowly got to her knees. In the space between his legs, she put her hands on his, which were clenched around the whiskey glass. You're not a stray anymore, Leonardo, she said. He let out a breath, a sound that was almost a shudder, and he let the glass go. He tangled his fingers in her hair, pulling her close, and kissed her. It was a kiss of profound, aching recognition. He began to let his walls down. She found, buried under the layers of the stone-faced boss, a man with a dry, sharp wit. One morning, she woke before him and, in a fit of domesticity she didn't recognize, tried to make him coffee. When he finally came into the kitchen, he took one sip, his face impassive. He held it in his mouth for a long second before swallowing. Well? She asked, biting her lip. He looked at the cup, then at her. I've had worse, he said, his tone grave. Liar. It's robust. It's terrible, isn't it? She said, a laugh bubbling up. It's an acquired taste. Oh my God, you hate it, she burst out, laughing, a real, genuine laugh, the first she could remember. His face broke, the mask of the boss cracked, and he smiled, a true, unguarded smile that lit his dark eyes and took 10 years off his face. It's the worst coffee I've ever had in my life, he admitted, his own laugh a low rumble in his chest. Give it here, she said, still giggling, and tried to snatch the mug. He held it over her head, and in that moment, they were just a man and a woman, laughing in a sunlit kitchen. The peace was shattered a week later. She was waiting for him. He was late, a meeting in the city with his capos. She was in the library, pacing. A storm was rolling in, and the wind was rattling the windows. She heard the car. It was coming in too fast, the sound of tires spitting gravel on the drive. She ran to the foyer, her heart a cold stone in her stomach. The front door burst open. Marcus and 2 other guards half carried Leonardo in. Boss, I'm fine, Leonardo roared, shoving them off, his face pale and twisted in a mask of pain. He stumbled, catching himself on the wall, and she saw it, the dark, wet stain spreading across the side of his white shirt, just under his arm. No, she breathed. His men were frantic. A setup. Albini's men. We were... Get out, Leonardo snarled at them. Get the perimeter locked down, now. They hesitated, looking at the blood. Go! They fled. He was left alone, leaning heavily against the marble wall, his eyes screwed shut. He was breathing hard, shallow gasps. She was frozen. He had been shot in the alley. He had been the predator. Here, he was just a man, bleeding on his own floor. Leo? Her voice was a trembling whisper. He opened his eyes. He saw her, and the pain in his face was replaced by a flash of shame, of anger at being seen this way, weak. Go to your room, he bit out. The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp fury. What? Go to your room. I'll handle... He winced, a sharp hiss of pain as he tried to straighten up. You'll handle nothing, she said, her voice shaking but hard. She marched over to him, grabbed his good arm, and slung it over her shoulder. You're an idiot. He was heavy, a dead weight, but she got him moving, half dragging him toward the library. Where is the first aid kit? In the bathroom. Behind the bar. He grunted. She dumped him unceremoniously onto the leather sofa. She ran to the bar, found the hidden bathroom, and located a medical kit that looked like it belonged in an operating room. When she got back, he was slumped over, his head in his hands, the blood now dripping onto the priceless Persian rug. Take off your shirt, she commanded. He just looked at her, his eyes glazed with pain. She didn't wait. She grabbed a pair of surgical shears from the kit and cut the $1,000 shirt from his body, the sound of the fabric ripping loud in the silent room. The wound was high on his ribs, a deep, blackened gash that was bleeding sluggishly. A graze, but a deep one. He'd been lucky, an inch lower, and it would have been his lung. Her hands were shaking, viciously. She couldn't stop them. I need antiseptic. Pressure, she muttered, her training from a long-forgotten first aid course kicking in. She grabbed a sterile pad and pressed it to the wound. Hard, Leonardo shouted, a raw sound of agony, and arched off the couch. I'm sorry, she sobbed, but she didn't let up. She held the pad in place with one hand, her knuckles white, and fumbled with the other for the bottle of antiseptic. It's all right, he gasped, his body trembling with shock. She worked for 20 minutes, her initial panic settling into a grim, focused rhythm. She cleaned the wound, her stomach rolling at the sight of his flesh, her own tears blurring her vision. He was silent, his eyes closed, his breathing harsh, but he didn't move. When she was finally done, she had taped a thick, sterile bandage over the wound. Her hands were covered in his blood. She was shaking so hard she thought she might fly apart. She sat back on her heels, looking at him. He looked pale, exhausted, but his eyes were open. He was watching her. You're a mess, he whispered, a weak smile playing on his lips. You. She couldn't speak. She just started to cry, silent, terrified sobs. He reached out his good hand, wincing, and touched her cheek. Hey, you could have...
I'll survive worse. He grinned weakly, but it was a grimace of pain. His eyes traveled down to where her hands, still bloody, were resting on his bare chest, right over his heart. But you, touching me like this. He breathed. It might finish me off. The sheer, stupid bravery of the joke, the vulnerability in his pain-filled eyes. It broke her. She surged forward, kissing him. It was a desperate, soft, terrified kiss. It was a plea. It was, don't you dare leave me. Her tears wet his face. She tasted his blood on her lips. He brought his other hand up, hissing in pain at the movement, and wrapped it in her hair, holding her to him. His kiss was weak, but it was full of a desperate, possessive need that matched her own. They stayed like that, holding each other through the night. She lay on the couch with him, her head on his uninjured shoulder, her hand spread over his heart, as if she could keep it beating by sheer force of will. 3 days later, he was recovering. He was a terrible patient, restless and angry at his own weakness. She was changing his dressing, her hands steady now, when Marcus knocked and entered, a small, coded envelope in his hand. Leonardo took it. He read the single line of text. She saw his face change. The patient was gone. The boss was back. The look in his eyes was a cold, black, lethal ice. What is it? She asked. It's over, he said, his voice flat. He stood, the movement still pained, and walked to the window. I have a location, a time. Dante and Albini. They're meeting tomorrow night. They think they're finalizing the trade.
your location for Albini's protection. So, she said, her heart hammering. It's done. It's done, he affirmed. He turned to her, his face a mask of stone, the protector. I'll handle it. You'll be safe here. When I come back, it will be finished. He was shutting her out. He was going to risk his life again to handle it. He was going to go to war for her, and she was supposed to just wait. Like a princess in a tower, like a stray he'd tucked away for safekeeping. The girl from the alley would have been grateful. The girl who had patched up his wound, the girl who had slept in his arms. She was something else. No. He blinked. What? No, she said, standing. Her voice was quiet, but it had the strength of the steel he'd taught her to fire. I'm not staying here. His face darkened. This is not a discussion. It's a war zone. You're not... I'm not what? She cut in. Helpless? You taught me not to be... weak? You showed me I wasn't. He took my life. Leonardo. He's the ghost that has haunted me, and he's the reason you have a hole in your side. I am not going to hide in your fortress while you go and get yourself killed. I am not going to be the price they trade. She walked toward him, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen, a fire he had kindled. I want to be there when it happens. Absolutely not. He roared, his protective fury rising. You could be killed, and you could be, too, she yelled back. You're not the only one with scars. You're not the only one who has something to lose. I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm telling you I'm going with you. I want to see his face, and I want him to see me. With you. He stared at her, his anger warring with something else, a fierce, burning pride. This was not the broken, terrified woman from the alley. This was not a stray. This was a lioness. This was his equal. He saw the determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw. She would find a way to go. With or without him. She would rather die on her feet than live on her knees, hidden away. He had resisted, but the fire in her eyes, it had won. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He reached out, his hand settling on her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. Then you'll go, he said, his voice a low, possessive growl. But you'll go as my queen. The warehouse smelled of rust, damp concrete, and rat poison. It was a vast, cavernous tomb in the industrial no-man's land by the river, its windows all shattered, its corrugated roof groaning under the assault of a cold November wind. This was the neutral ground Albini had chosen for the peace talk, a fiction so thin it was transparent. She sat on a folding chair in the center of the vast, empty floor. It was the only piece of furniture in the 100-foot space. She was the bait, and she was the queen. Beneath her clothes, she was a web of contradictions. Taped to her ribs, just below her heart, was a cold, flat microphone, a wire. It felt like a metallic centipede against her skin. Under her elegant, dark wool coat, one Leonardo had chosen, she wore a slim, state-of-the-art ballistic vest. It was light, but its rigid pressure against her chest was a constant, terrifying reminder of why she was here. Leonardo stood 10 feet to her left, a stone-faced shadow. He was unarmed, or at least that's what the fiction demanded. She knew he had a custom-made, ceramic-bladed knife in his boot and a thin, powerful .380 pistol holstered in the small of his back. Completely invisible beneath his tailored black suit, his face was granite, unreadable. His eyes fixed on the massive sliding bay doors. He was a portrait of lethal calm. He was also a liar. He wasn't just armed. He was an army, she knew, because she had watched them deploy. In the crumbling upper offices, 2 of his best snipers were in position. In the rafters, 4 more of his inner circle, including Marcus, were hidden, armed with short-barreled automatic rifles, their black gear making them invisible in the gloom. The entire perimeter of the warehouse, for 3 blocks, was locked down by his men. Albini and Dante were walking into a steel trap, and they didn't even know it. You're cold, Leonardo said, his voice not moving, not echoing in the vast space. I'm fine, she said. Her hands, clasped in her lap, were steady. She'd never been more terrified in her life, and she had never... ever felt more alive. Remember the plan, he said, his eyes still on the door. You say what you need to say, but the moment I move, you drop. You get behind me. You do not wait. You do not think. I won't, she said. A low rumble sounded from outside. Headlights, bright and obnoxious, swept through the broken windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. A heavy vehicle, an SUV, skidded to a stop on the gravel. Doors slammed, voices, rough and laughing. Leonardo's body became unnervingly still. He was a panther, coiled. Every ounce of his being focused on the door. The massive bay door screeched, sliding open just enough for a man to walk through. The first to enter was a short, stocky man in an expensive camel hair coat. His face was scarred, his eyes small and black. This was Albini. He looked around the warehouse, his expression a mask of open contempt. What is this? Albini's voice was a gravelly sneer. No welcome party, no drinks, just you, and... His eyes fell on her. Behind him, a second figure emerged, swaggering out of the darkness. Dante. He was thinner than she remembered, his skin sallow, his eyes too bright, fueled by drugs and a pathetic, borrowed arrogance. He wore a cheap, flashy jacket, and a smug, proprietary grin split his face. He looked at her, and his grin widened, a terrible, sleazy expression of possession. Well, Dante said, his voice echoing. He ignored Leonardo completely, his focus entirely on her. Look at my girl, all cleaned up, playing house with the big man. You look good, baby. You always did look good when you were scared. He took a step toward her. Leonardo shifted, a movement so subtle it was barely perceptible, but it was enough. Dante stopped, his bravado faltering as he finally acknowledged the man beside her. Easy, Leo, Albini said, holding up a hand. We're here to talk, my boy. He's just sentimental. He's the one with the merchandise, after all. She's not merchandise. Leonardo's voice was flat, colder than the wind. She is whatever I say she is, Dante spat, his courage returning under Albini's shadow. He walked in a slow circle, just out of arm's reach. Look at you, living in a palace, wearing his clothes. Did you forget? Huh? Did you forget who you belong to? He was close enough now that she could smell him, stale sweat, cheap cologne, and the bitter tang of chemicals that brought back a rush of suffocating memories. I never belonged to you. Dante, she said, and she was shocked to hear her voice. It wasn't the whisper of the stray girl. It was cold, clear, and steady. Dante laughed, a high-pitched, ugly sound. Is that right? You think you're some gangster's girl now? His queen? He mocked the word Leonardo had used. He's just using you. You're a pet, a toy. You think he's any different from me? He's worse. He's just got more money. He'll get tired of you, and then he'll throw you back in the trash where he found you. He looked at Leonardo. Or maybe I'll just take you back. After Albini here is done with him. We had a deal. I give him the witness. He gives me... you. Albini smiled, a predator's baring of teeth. The deal's simple. Elle, you've been a thorn in my side for a decade. This little witness. She's going to testify. She's going to talk about a certain murder. A murder your people were seen cleaning up. You're going down. And I'm going to take... everything. It was a lie. The wire she wore wasn't for the police. It was for Leonardo's men, broadcasting every word. The cleanup Albini was bluffing about was a fiction. This was all just a show, but the threat from Dante was real. You're pathetic, she said, standing up from the chair. Dante's smile faltered. What did you say to me? You're nothing, she said, her voice rising, clear and strong, cutting through the vast space. She took a step toward him, and this time, he was the one who flinched. I'm not his. I was never yours. You're just a sad, pathetic, junky coward. You were always a coward. You shut your mouth, he hissed, his hand straying to his jacket. You killed that man because you were too weak to stand up to him. You hit me because you were too small to feel like a man. And I didn't run because I was scared of you. Dante. She took another step, her eyes blazing. All her fear burned away and replaced by a white-hot, righteous rage.
I ran because you were too much of a coward to protect anyone, and I was done being suffocated by your failure. Bitch! He screamed, his face contorting. The smugness was gone, replaced by the raw, animalistic panic of a cornered rat. You're nobody. You're nothing. He pulled the gun. It happened in a fraction of a second, a blur of motion. He wasn't aiming at Leonardo. He wasn't aiming at Albini. His eyes were on her. The gun came up, his hand shaking. Dante, no! Albini shouted, but it was too late. She didn't have time to think. She only had time to see Leonardo's face, his eyes widening, not in fear, but in a sudden, explosive fury. He didn't push her. He didn't duck. He threw himself in front of her. His body was a solid wall, a shield, slamming into her, knocking her back. In the same instant, the warehouse exploded with light and sound, a single gunshot, deafeningly loud. Leonardo grunted, a sharp, choked sound. As his body absorbed the impact, he was thrown back, colliding with her, and they both went down, a tangle of limbs on the concrete floor. It was the last moment of silence. The world erupted. Now! Marcus's voice roared from the rafters, and the air was torn apart by a volley of automatic gunfire. It wasn't a fight, it was an execution. Bullets ripped through the darkness, bright white flashes from above, converging on Albini and his two bodyguards, who had just emerged. Chaos. She was on the floor, her ears ringing, the smell of gunpowder thick in her mouth. She was pinned beneath Leonardo's heavy, limp body. Leo, she screamed, her voice lost in the din. Leo! She shoved at his shoulders. He was unmoving. Leonardo! The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The only sound was the wind, the distant echo, and the drip of water. Albini and his men were down, unmoving, but Dante was scrambling, crawling, heading for the small side door he had come in through. Leo, please, she sobbed, pushing his weight off her. She rolled him over. His face was pale, his eyes closed. A dark, spreading stain was soaking his left shoulder. High on his chest, blood. So much blood. No, 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 she whispered, her hands shaking as she pressed them to the wound. You can't. You promised. His eyes flickered open. He looked at her, and a slow, painful smile touched his lips. His face was beaded with sweat, his breath a shallow rasp. He reached up, his hand weak, and touched her cheek. His fingers were sticky with his own blood. Told you, he whispered, his voice a broken, rattling sigh. Told you. I'd take one for you. You idiot, she sobbed. You stupid, stubborn. His eyes were fading. He was losing too much blood. His hand fell from her face, his body going slack. No, she said. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. No. You don't get to do this. You don't get to save me and then leave me. She looked up. Dante was at the door, fumbling with the latch, looking back at them with wild, terrified eyes. He was going to get away. A cold, clear, silent rage, an emotion purer than any she had ever felt, washed over her. The fear was gone. The grief was gone. There was only ice. She looked at Leonardo, his face now a waxy, ashen gray. His .380 was still in the holster at his back. Her movements were quick, precise. She rolled him gently, her hands no longer shaking. She pulled the gun from its holster. It was warm from his body, heavy and solid in her hand. She didn't check the safety. She didn't check the load. She knew, with absolute certainty, that he would have it ready. She rose to her feet. Dante! Her voice, sharp and cold as a razor, cut through the warehouse. He froze, his hand on the door, and turned. His face was a mask of animal terror. She raised the gun, just as Leonardo had taught her. Both hands, a firm grip, breathe out. He saw the gun, and he raised his hands. No, please, don't. I'm sorry. He made me. Albini made me. You're a coward, she said, her voice flat. She wasn't aiming at his head. She wasn't aiming at his heart. She was aiming at his escape. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was contained, a sharp crack that was nothing like the thunder of the rifles. The recoil slammed her arm, but she held her ground. Dante screamed, a high, thin shriek as the bullet shattered his leg just below the knee. He collapsed like a puppet, clutching his mangled limb, writhing on the filthy concrete. He wasn't going anywhere. She stood there for a moment, the gun smoking in her hand, the sound of his screams a symphony. The side door flew open. Marcus and 2 other men stormed in, their weapons raised. They stopped, taking in the scene. Albini and his men, dead. Leonardo, bleeding on the floor, her standing, gun in hand, Dante screaming. "The package is secure," she said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "The boss is down." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Get the van," he roared at one man. He ran to Leonardo's side, his face grim, pulling a military-grade trauma kit from his vest. Boss, stay with me." "He's alive," she said. He's fading. The van's here." A black, windowless van screeched to a halt inside the warehouse. They were moving. A whirlwind of practiced efficiency. Marcus and another man had Leonardo on a stretcher, pressing field dressings to the wound. "What about him?" the third man asked, nodding at Dante, who was now sobbing. "Leave him," she said, her voice cold. "He can wait." "No, ma'am," Marcus said, his voice clipped. "Boss's orders." He looked at the man. "The anonymous call. Make it now. Let the police find Albini, and let them find that." He jerked his chin at Dante. "He's all theirs. Our part is done." Sirens wailed in the far distance. The anonymous call had already been made. "Albini fled," Marcus said, as if reciting a script. "A deal gone wrong. Our associate was caught in the crossfire. We're ghosts." "We were never here. Get him in the van," she said, her focus only on Leonardo's pale face. They loaded him in. She climbed in after, sitting on the floor of the rattling van, cradling his head in her lap as Marcus continued to work, grimly applying pressure. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Not a hospital," Marcus grunted. "A clinic. Private, secure." The ride was a blur of darkness and desperation. She just watched him, her hand on his uninjured chest, feeling the faint, shallow rise and fall. She whispered his name, over and over, a prayer, a threat, a promise. The clinic was in the basement of an anonymous office building, a gleaming white, sterile world of steel and glass. A full surgical team was waiting. They rushed him from the van, onto a gurney. Severe blood loss, single gunshot to the left shoulder, possible arterial bleed. Marcus rattled off. A doctor in blue scrubs looked at her. "You need to wait here." "No," she said. "Ma'am, this is a sterile—" "No." She grabbed the side of the gurney, her knuckles white, her hands still stained with his blood. "I'm not leaving him." They were trying to push her back, a kind-faced nurse trying to take her arm. "Honey, you're in shock." "I'm not leaving him," she roared, the last of her old self, the last of the victim, burning away in a final, defiant inferno. They were wheeling him toward the operating room. A nurse approached her with a syringe. "We need to calm you down." "Don't you touch me," she snarled. Leonardo's eyes flickered. He was barely conscious, but he saw the nurse. He saw her. "Let her," he gurgled, a bloody cough. "Let her stay." She stays. The doctor looked at the nurse, at Leonardo, and at her. He saw the gun in her waistband, which she'd tucked there without thinking. He saw the blood. He saw the look in her eyes. "Fine." The doctor snapped. "Get her scrubs. If she faints, drag her out. Now, move." They pushed him through the double doors. She was right beside him, her hand on his, never letting go as they began to place the mask over his face. His eyes found hers. Just before the anesthetic took him, she didn't look away. She was not the girl who hid. She was not the girl who ran. She was the woman who stayed. The first thing he registered was the beeping. Slow, steady, infuriatingly rhythmic. It was the sound of a sterile, safe place, and he hated it. The second thing was the smell, antiseptic and clean sheets, not the metallic tang of blood and gunpowder he remembered. The third, and the only thing that mattered, was the pressure on his right hand. He forced his eyes open. The light was dim, the room a blur of pale grays. It took a moment for his vision to focus, his body feeling like it was submerged in wet cement. He was weak, weaker than he had been since he was a child. The bullet, the surgery. They had taken more than just blood. He turned his head, a small, agonizing movement that cost him a wave of nausea. She was there. She was slumped over in a hard, plastic visitor's chair that she had dragged to his bedside. Her head was resting on the mattress, her cheek pillowed on their joined hands. She was asleep, her breathing deep and even, her hair falling across her face, even in the harsh, low light. He could see the dark smudges of exhaustion under her eyes, the dried tear tracks on her cheek, the faint streaks of his own blood she hadn't been able to wash from beneath her fingernails. She was still wearing the scrubs the clinic staff had given her. She looked like a refugee from a war, which, he supposed, she hadn't left. The doctors, the nurses, his own men, they had all tried to get her to rest, to go to a clean room. She had refused, her eyes blazing, her hand clutching his, a silent, feral guardian at his bedside. She had stayed through the entire 8-hour surgery, a silent, scrubbed-in specter, and she had not left the room in the 2 days since. He was alive. He knew, with a certainty that went beyond medicine, that her grip was the main reason. He squeezed her hand, a movement that felt like it took all the strength he had left. It was enough. Her eyes flew open with a small, startled gasp. She was disoriented for a second, then her gaze locked on his. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just stared, as if memorizing his face. "Hey," he whispered, his voice a dry, rasping ruin. Her face crumpled. The dam of her exhaustion and terror finally broke. A single, profound sob escaped her, and she brought his hand to her lips, kissing his knuckles, her forehead pressing against the back of his hand. "You're an idiot," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Heard that already," he rasped, a faint smile touching his lips. "I mean it," she said, her voice fierce as she sat up, wiping her eyes with the back of her free hand. "You threw yourself. You didn't even... What if I hadn't?" "But you did," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "You were always going to..." She stared at him, and in that moment, the power dynamic that had defined them, the savior and the stray, the protector and the victim, it evaporated. They were just two people, scarred and bleeding, who had walked through fire and come out the other side. The recovery was slow, and it was agonizing, mostly for him. He was a man of action, of control, to be laid flat, to be unable to sit up without help, to be at the mercy of his own healing body, was a special kind of hell, but she was his anchor. She became his hands, his strength, his warden, and, in the quiet, endless hours, his confessor. The first week, he couldn't hold a spoon. She fed him. She sat on the edge of his bed in the private estate, to which they had moved after a week, and patiently spooned soup into his mouth, ignoring his dark, frustrated muttering. "It's just soup, Leonardo," she'd say, her tone light, her eyes laughing at him. "It's humiliating. It's broth, and you're going to eat it, or I'm going to have Marcus hold you down, and I'll..." All right, he'd grumble, opening his mouth, and she would smile. A small, genuine smile that lit her face and made his chest ache more than the bullet wound. When he was well enough to be propped up, he woke one morning to find her studying his face, a frown of concentration on her lips. She was holding his razor and a bowl of hot water. "Absolutely not, yeah?" he said. "What?" she asked, her expression all innocence. "You look like a grizzly bear, and you're scratching my face when I kiss you. It has to go. I'll have Marcus." "Marcus is busy. I'm here." "And you," she said, tapping his nose, "are not allowed to move, so be quiet." He was terrified. He trusted her with his life, with his empire, but with a straight razor near his throat? Her hands were a revelation. They were not the trembling, hesitant hands of the girl from the alley. They were steady, careful, and infinitely gentle. She held his jaw, her touch warm, and with slow, deliberate strokes, she shaved him, her focus absolute. It was the most intimate thing they had ever done. He sat there, his eyes closed, his life literally in her hands, and felt a profound, unconditional trust settle in his bones. They laughed. He told her stories of Sal, of his first disastrous attempts to run a business. She told him about her mother, about her childhood dream of being a painter.
They were not two broken pieces. They were two whole, damaged people, learning the shape of each other, the outside world. However, had not stopped. "Dante?" she asked one night, her voice quiet. She was curled at the foot of his bed, reading a book. What happened? Leonardo had been waiting for the question. He survived. The leg. "It's a mess, but he'll walk." "Good," she said, and the coldness in her voice made him look up. "I'm glad. I didn't want him dead. I just wanted him to stop." "He stopped," Leonardo assured her. "The police, the ones from the anonymous call, they found him. They also found the body of Albini, and a very informative recording from a wire that was found at the scene." "The wire I was wearing," she stated. "A different wire," he corrected, a small smile playing on his lips. "An anonymous one. The recording had Dante, very clearly, confessing to the murder of his old partner. It also had him conspiring with Albini to traffic a witness. The D is overjoyed. Dante is facing 25 to life. He'll never see the street again. He took a plea deal this morning." She closed her eyes, a long, slow breath leaving her body. It was the sound of a 6-month-old chain. Finally, rusting and breaking apart, it was over. Dante was a ghost, finally exorcised, not by violence, but by the law, his law. "And Albini's organization?" she asked. "In chaos. They have no leader, no proof of who was there. We were ghosts, remember? They're finished. It's done." She was free. But she found that freedom, after so long, was its own kind of terror. "I don't know who I am," she confessed to him, one rainy afternoon. "I'm not the girl who was running. I'm not just your woman." Leonardo sat up, wincing, but his eyes were serious. "No, you're not. You're the one who shot Dante. You're the one who patched me up. You're the one who isn't afraid of me." "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "You do whatever you want," he said. He reached for her hand. I know a woman, a doctor. She's very discreet. She helped me, after Sal. After a lot of things, she just listens. If you wanted to talk." She looked at him, at this powerful, scarred man, admitting he had needed help, admitting he had been broken. He was giving her a gift, not just of his protection, but of his own vulnerability. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." She started therapy twice a week. She took a car to a quiet, private office, and she talked. She talked about Dante. She talked about the alley. She talked about the warehouse. And she talked about her mother and the paintings she used to want to make. She started to change. The shadows in her eyes, the ones that had been there, even when she laughed, they began to recede. She started sketching again, first in the margins of his books and then on a real sketch pad he'd left for her. She even, one night, timidly mentioned going back to school. "I could maybe take an art class online." She'd said, "You could buy the school," he'd replied, deadpan, "but a class is a good start." The day came, 3 weeks after the shooting, when his doctor, the same private one from the clinic, cleared him for light activity. His shoulder was a map of angry, healing tissue, but it was healing. That night, he found her in the penthouse. They had come back to the city, the estate feeling too much like a hospital. She was standing by the glass wall, looking down at the city lights, the same way she had on her second night, but she wasn't a prisoner. She was the owner. He walked up behind her, his footsteps silent. He was still favoring his side, but he was walking. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The girl who was here?" she said, her voice soft. She was so scared. She was sitting right there, on the floor, convinced you were a monster. "Was she wrong?" he asked, his voice rough. She turned to him. She stepped into his space, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, over his heart. "You're a lot of things. Leonardo, you're dangerous, you're stubborn. And you're mine. But you're not a monster. A monster wouldn't have taken a bullet for her." He put his hands on her waist, his grip careful. "I'm sorry I'm not much of a dancer." "What?" She laughed. "I've got a bad shoulder, a bad everything, but I feel like—" He looked at her, and his dark, guarded eyes were open and full of a feeling that was so new, it terrified him more than any bullet. He walked to the sound system, a sleek, invisible panel in the wall. He touched a control, and music filled the room. Not opera, not the hard classical he sometimes listened to. It was a slow, soft, soulful song, a human voice, singing about being lost and found. He walked back to her and held out his good hand. "May I?" She smiled, her eyes shining. "You're ridiculous." "I am," he agreed. She took his hand. She was barefoot. He was in his sock feet, and in the middle of the vast marble-floored penthouse, with the city of a million lights glittering below them, they danced. It was slow, barely a movement. He just held her, his injured arm resting lightly on her back, his good arm holding her hand. She rested her head on his good shoulder, her arms wrapped around his waist, being careful of his ribs. They swayed to the music, two survivors, two broken people who had somehow found a way to be whole. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They just held each other. The silence, the music, and the city lights saying everything. Later, they sat on the sofa, a comfortable silence between them, the future, which had once been a terrifying, minute-by-minute question of survival, was now a possibility. "I was thinking," he said, staring at the lights. "The estate is safe, but it's not a home. It's a fortress. I've been looking at some real estate, outside the city, on the water, a place with no guards. No ghosts," she finished. He nodded. "A place for, a garden, maybe a dog." She smiled. "A dog. You? The mafia boss wants a golden retriever? A Rottweiler, maybe," he conceded, a faint smile on his lips. "But a place for a future." He said the word like it was foreign. For, maybe, kids. One day. If that's... He couldn't say it. This man who commanded a dozen crews, who had brought a rival family to its knees. He was fumbling. She put her hand over his. "Maybe," she said, her voice soft. "One day." He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and then he reached into his pocket. She tensed. She expected a box, a ring, a grand gesture. He just pulled out his hand. It was empty. He took her hand, the one that wasn't holding his, and he just held it. He looked at her, his eyes dark and intense, and full of a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. "I don't have a ring," he said, his voice rough. I'm not good at this, but I know one thing." He held her gaze. "I'm not letting you go. Ever. The night I found you, I told myself I was saving you. But I was wrong." He took a breath. "You saved me from the silence." He held her hand tighter. There was no grand speech, no diamonds, just a simple, impossible question from a man who had never asked for anything. "Stay?" Her eyes filled with tears, not of fear, not of sadness, of recognition. This wasn't a transaction, it wasn't a debt, it was a choice, her choice. She nodded, the tears overflowing, rolling down her cheeks. "This time," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This time, I trust what I feel." He brought her hand to his lips, his own eyes shining, and he kissed her knuckles. "Thank you," he whispered. The cafe was loud. It was crowded. It smelled of dark roast coffee and burnt sugar. It was, she knew, Dante's old haunt, the place he used to hold his pathetic court, where he'd meet his crew. She sat at a table by the window, the late afternoon sun warm on her face. She was sketching in her notepad, a quick, confident drawing of the street scene outside. She was wearing jeans and a simple, soft red sweater. She looked normal. She took a sip of her coffee, her eyes scanning the room, unafraid. She saw the men who looked like him, the ones with the same cheap swagger, the same dead eyes. They held no power. They were just noise. Her fear was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, solid strength that was rooted so deep it was part of her bones. The bell over the door chimed. Leonardo walked in. He wore a simple, dark peacoat over a gray shirt. He looked to anyone else like just another businessman.
but she saw the way he moved, the way his eyes scanned the room in a single, fluid motion. She saw the power he held in reserve, the quiet, lethal authority. He saw her, and the hardness in his face melted. He smiled. He walked to her table, sliding into the booth opposite her. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers, which was resting on her sketchbook. "You're smiling," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I am," she said. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. "I'm happy." He watched her, his gaze full of a fierce, protective, and profoundly gentle love. He had taken the bullet, but she had saved his life. She trusted no one, until the man who bled for her showed her how to live again. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment and let me know. If you enjoyed this, be sure to subscribe to Mafia Romance Stories for more. And please, share your thoughts in English. I read every single comment.